Part the Second, Chapter 9 of Dick Sands the Boy Captain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alex E. Delander, Davis, California. Dick Sands the Boy Captain by Jules Verne. Translated by Ellen E. Frewer. Part the Second, Chapter 9. Kazonnde. By the 26th of May, when the caravan reached Kazonnde, the number of the slaves had diminished by more than half, so numerous had been the casualties along the road. But the dealers were quite prepared to make a market of their loss. The demand for slaves was very great, and the price must be raised accordingly. Angola at what time was the scene of a large negro traffic, and as the caravans principally wended their way towards the interior, the Portuguese authorities at Loanda and Benguela had practically no power to prevent it. The barracks on the shore were crowded to overflowing with prisoners, the few slave ships that managed to elude the cruisers being quite inadequate to embark the whole number of the Spanish colonies to America. Kazonnde, the point whence the caravans diverged to the various parts of the Lake District, is situated 3 miles from the mouth of the Coanza, and is one of the most important lacones, or markets of the province. The open market place, where the slaves are exposed for sale, is called the Chitoka. All the larger towns of Central Africa are divided into two distinct parts, one occupied by the Arab, Portuguese, or native merchants, and containing their slave barracks, the other being the residence of the negro king, often a fierce drunk potentate, whose rule is a reign of terror, and who lives by subsidies allowed him by the traders. The commercial quarter of Kazonnde now belonged to José Antonio Alves. It was his largest depot, although he had another at Bihé, and a third at Cassange, where Cameron subsequently met him. It consisted of one long street, on each side of which were groups of flat-roofed houses, called tembes, built of rough earth, and provided with square yards for cattle. The end of it opened into the chitoka, which was surrounded by the barracks. Above the houses some fine banyan trees waved their branches, surmounted here and there by the crests of graceful palms. There was at least a score of birds of prey that hovered about the streets, and came down to perform the office of public scavengers. At no great distance flowed the Luhi, a river not yet explored, but which is supposed to be an affluent or sub-affluent of the Congo. Adjoining the commercial quarter was the royal residence, nothing more nor less than a collection of dirty huts, extending over an area of nearly a square mile. Some of these huts were unenclosed, others were surrounded by a palisade of reeds, or by a hedge of bushy figs. In an enclosure within a papyrus fence were about 30 huts appropriated to the king's slaves, another group for his wives, and in the middle, almost hidden by a plantation of manioc, a tembe larger and loftier than the rest, the abode of the monarch himself. He had sorely declined from the dignity and importance of his predecessors, and his army, which by the early Portuguese traders had been estimated at 20,000, now numbered less than 4,000 men. No longer could he afford, as in the good old time, to order a sacrifice of 25 or 30 slaves at one offering. His name was Moene Lunga. Little over 50, he was prematurely aged by drink and debauchery, and scarcely better than a maniac. His subjects, officers, and ministers were all liable to be mutilated at his pleasure, and noses and ears, feet and hands, were cut off unsparingly whenever his caprice so willed it. His death would have been a cause of regret to no one, with the exception, perhaps, of Alves, who was on very good terms with him. Alves, moreover, feared that in the event of the present king's death, the succession of his chief wife, Queen Moena, might be disputed, and that his dominions would be invaded by a younger and more active neighbour, one of the kings of Ukusu, who had already seized upon some villages dependent on the government of Kazonnde, and who was in alliance with a rival trader named Tipo Tipo, a man of pure Arab extraction, from whom Cameron afterwards received a visit at Nyangwe. To all intents and purposes Alves was the real sovereign of the district, having fostered the vices of the brutalized king till he had him completely in his power. He was a man considerably advanced in his years. He was not, as his name might imply, a white man, but had merely assumed his Portuguese title for purposes of business. His true name was Kendele, and he was a pure negro by birth, being a native of Dondo on the Coanza. He had commenced life as a slave dealer's agent, and was now on his way towards becoming a first-class trader. That is to say, he was a consummate rascal under the guise of an honest man. He it was whom Cameron met at the end of 1874 at Kilemba, the capital of Urua, of which Kasongo is chief, and with whose caravan he travelled to Bihé, a distance of 700 miles. It was midday when the caravan entered Kazonnde. The journey from the Coanza had lasted 38 days, more than 5 weeks of misery as great as was within human power to endure. Amidst the noise of drums and coodoo horns, the slaves were conducted to the market place. The soldiers of the caravan discharged their guns in the air, and old Alvez's retinue responded with a similar salute. The bandits, than which the soldiers were nothing better, were delighted to meet again, and would celebrate their return by a season of riot and excess. The slaves, reduced to a total of about 250, were many of them almost dead from exhaustion. The forks were removed from their necks, though the chains were still retained, and the whole of them were driven into barracks that were unfit even for cattle, to await, in company with 1200 to 1500 other captives already there, the great market which will be held 2 days hence. The pagazis, after delivering their loads of ivory, would only stay to receive their payment of a few yards of calico or other stuff, and would then depart at once to join some other caravan. On being relieved from the forks which they had carried for so many weary days, Tom and his companions heartily wrung each other's hands, but they could not venture to utter one word of mutual encouragement. The three younger men, more full of life and vigour, had resisted the effects of the fatigue, but poor old Tom was nearly exhausted, and had the march been protracted for a few more days, he must have shared Nan's fate and been left behind, a prey to the wild beasts. Upon their arrival all four were packed into a narrow cell, where some food was provided, and the door was immediately locked upon them. The chitoka was now almost deserted, and Dick Sands was left there under the special charge of a havildar. He lost no opportunity of peering into every hut in the hope of catching a glimpse of Mrs. Weldon, who, if Hercules had not misinformed him, had come on hither just in front. But he was very much perplexed. He could well understand that Mrs. Weldon, if still a prisoner, would be kept out of sight, but why Negoro and Harris did not appear to triumph over him in his humiliation was quite a mystery to him. It was likely enough that the presence of either one or the other of them would be the signal for himself to be exposed to fresh indignity, or even to torture, but Dick would have welcomed the sight of them at Kazonnde, were it only as an indication that Mrs. Weldon and Jack were there also. It disappointed him too that Dingo did not come back. Ever since the dog had brought him the first note, he had kept an answer written ready to send to Hercules, imploring him to look after Mrs. Weldon, and to keep him informed of everything. He began to fear that the faithful creature must be dead, perhaps perished in some attempt to reach himself. It was, however, quite possible that Hercules had taken the dog in some other direction, hoping to gain some depot in the interior. But so thoroughly had Dick persuaded himself that Mrs. Weldon had preceded him to Kazonnde, that his disappointment became more and more keen when he failed to discover her. For a while he seemed to yield to despair, and sat down sorrowful and sick at heart. Suddenly a chorus of voices and trumpets broke upon his ear. He was startled into taking a new interest in what was going on. "Alvez! Alvez!" was the cry, again and again repeated by the crowd. Here, then, was the great man himself about to appear. Was it not likely that Harris and Negoro might be with him? Dick stood erect and resolute, his eyes vivid with expectation. He felt all eagerness to stand face to face with his betrayers. Boy as he was equal to cope with them both. The kitanda, which came in sight at the end of the street, was nothing more than a kind of hammock covered by a faded and ragged curtain. An old negro stepped out of it. His attendants greeted him with noisy acclamations. This, then, was the great trader, José Antonio Alvez. Immediately following him was his friend Coimbra, son of the chief Coimbra of Bihé, and, according to Cameron, the greatest blackguard in the province. This sworn ally of Alvez, this organizer of his slave raids, this commander, worthy of his own horde of bandits, was utterly loathsome in his appearance. His flesh was filthy dirty, his eyes were bloodshot, his skin yellow, and his long hair all dishevelled. He had no other attire than a tattered shirt, a tunic made of grass, and a battered straw hat, under which his countenance appeared like that of some old hag. Alvez himself, whose clothes were like those of an old Turk the day after a carnival, was 1 degree more respectable in appearance than his satellite, not that his looks spoke much for the very highest class of African slave dealers. To Dick's great disappointment neither Harris nor Negoro were among his retinue. Both Alvez and Coimbra shook hands with Ibn Hamish, the leader of the caravan, and congratulated him on the success of the expedition. Alvez made a grimace at being told that half the slaves had died on the way, but on the whole he seemed satisfied. He could meet the demand that at present existed, and would lose no time in bartering the new arrival for ivory or hanas, copper in the shape of a St. Andrew's cross, the form in which the metal is exported in Central Africa. After complimenting the havildars upon the way in which they had done their work, the trader gave orders that the porters should be paid and dismissed. The conversations were carried on in a mixture of Portuguese and native idioms, in which the African element abounded so largely that a native of Lisbon